Welcome back. I'm Sunir Shah, President of Cloud Software Association, CEO of AppBind. This is another Agency Connect. I have a really interesting story. Well, Tony here, Tony Guarnaccia from Castocity has a really interesting story of how he started an agency after coming from corporate and took all his lessons he learned about corporate management into running an agency profitably. And that's, after all, what this podcast is about. How do you get out of the scalability trap of an agency and build a profitable agency? And so with that, I'm going to just throw it over to you, Tony, to introduce yourself, Castocity, and a little bit of your background.
Yeah, sure. So my name is Tony Guarnaccia, as you mentioned. I've been in marketing for 20 plus years, have done some interesting things over the years, but really my whole story started when I was a kid. And so when I was 12 years old, my parents had an Italian bakery. My dad was an amazing baker. Unfortunately, not the best at business. And so at the age of 12, we lost everything. We lost the house, the car, had to even give up my dog. And it was kind of a really challenging thing. And so that kind of set the precedent of where I was going to go in my career, because despite all that, I wanted to be an entrepreneur as well. And so I went to school, learned what I needed to, and then launched one of the first online bakeries in the world. And so we had good success there. We served Jennifer Lopez, Jay-Z, some big corporate clients. And here I am in my mid-20s thinking, hey, I got business down, what could go wrong? And unfortunately, that business closed as well. And I learned some hard lessons that I didn't know what I didn't know. So I left there to go into the corporate world, to kind of work. And my intention was to work with the best companies in the world to learn kind of how to scale and grow, which I did. I ended up working with Google and Ford and ADP and just a whole list, over a dozen Fortune 500 companies, 10,000 small businesses. So I took what I learned there and said, okay, now that I got this down, I want to go back to my entrepreneurial roots. And that's why I decided to launch my first kind of agency, which was called Big Fish Results, whose mission was to bring the strategies, tools, and tactics of the best companies to small business. And I did that after the corporate world, which was about 10 years. I went to my own agency for roughly 10 years. And along that journey, we'll talk about here today. But that's kind of full circle of how I got to where I am today.
If I known your childhood backstory, we would have just talked about that, because I have a similar backstory, not quite as devastating as yours. My grandfather went bankrupt, but then that kind of generational knowledge, keeps going down. But then the entrepreneurial spirit continues in all of us. But I love what you did about going to the corporate world to learn more, because I think a lot of agency owners start off right away in the consulting space, freelancers or whatever, without having gone to the professional world where your clients live, understanding what they expect and also what made these companies successful. Yeah. I would let's go to there. But before we do that, you should pitch yourself, because Castocity is pretty cool. I don't want to give you no opportunity to explain what you're doing right now, because that's also part of the story. So tell us a little bit about Castocity just before we go on to the rest.
Yeah, so to go full kind of where we are today, my vision along the lines when I was doing the agency was always to launch a software company. And so I'm finally at that point today. It's called Castocity. And what it does is it helps make podcasting profitable. And it does that through a variety of tools that essentially automate your marketing monetization of podcast interviews. The first product we released is called Podcast One Sheet. And if you're familiar with getting booked on podcasts, which by the way is a great agency business, hint, hint, what you can do is you get booked on podcasts. To do that, you need a one sheet. And it's kind of like a resume, but instead of a resume for getting job interviews, it's a resume for getting podcast interviews. So that's how the podcasters vet who's a great guest. And so traditionally, it's been a very manual process done with PDFs. It's not interactive, can't be mobile optimized. So we solved all those problems by creating a dynamic one sheet, and it's doing really, really well. And we're releasing an agency version next in about a quarter.
Amazing. Thank you. Awesome. And there are a lot of podcast agencies. I know it's a pretty interesting around AppBind. It's a pretty interesting space for sure, growing. And we'll talk about hopefully the meaning of using the productized services as part of the podcast service. But let's talk a little bit about your corporate experience, because that's where your experience came from. You said you were running you ran over $400 million. Is that in Google Ads? That's quite a lot. Is that
Yeah,
right?
yeah, I was fortunate. I think part of success is obviously knowing what you need to and being prepared and being in the right place. But a big part of it is really timing and just being well positioned. And so I was fortunate to kind of ride the wave, and this is actually one of the concepts I teach in terms of success, being able to ride the wave of whatever is hot. So, it wasn't by chance I launched into the podcast space. That's kind of very popular now. Obviously, the NFTs and blockchain and everything in crypto is really hot right now. But back then, of course, it was search engine optimization. So I got in that very early. I was very early in databases and data management and things like that. But also, I was very early in Google AdWords. So I was one of the first people to kind of embrace that. And because of that, I had the opportunity to work with some of the best companies in the world. So I had Google's Agency of the Year back in 2009. And we did that, believe it or not, through joint ventures. So I did and it wasn't just me, obviously, it was a team. But I did a joint venture with Google and a joint venture with Ford. And that's really what kind of got this huge ad spend. And as time went on, I worked with basically all the automotive OEMs, which are kind of the manufacturers. That's the term for a manufacturer. So, General Motors, BMW, Volkswagen, pretty much every manufacturer with the exception of Honda. So if anyone knows Honda, would love to work with them so I can finish out the list there. But that's basically how I got to spending ridiculous amounts of money in the corporate world.
Yeah, it's amazing. So like what do you think, were the main lessons you learned from that when you started an agency, you're like, I have to do this?
Yeah, well, from an agency perspective, I mean, one of the biggest things I've learned over the year is the concept of value. So people really buy from you, and it sounds kind of simplistic, but a lot of people don't get it. It's exchange of value. So what you provide should be ideally 10x of what they're receiving. And kind of what I learned over the years is there's really two kinds of value. There's real value, and then there's perceived value. So the real value is what they're actually getting as a benefit of working with you. And that's usually exchanging money for some sort of result. So all of my agency businesses all have the term result in them, because that's at the end of the day, that's what they want. They want a transformation. They want the end result. But then there's also the perception that's on top of that. So in the agency world, you need to have your own personal brand, which kind of connects to the podcasting world. You have to have perceived value. And so from an agency perspective, this goes down into your productization and your packaging. How you package things. I mean, look no further than Apple, right? I mean, they have the phone. It's not just a phone. They have beautiful packaging, beautiful design. And so all these things really differentiate an agency and help you command a higher kind of bigger margins, basically.
This is becoming a consistent theme on this podcast. I'm learning too. And, one thing I've learned is that the agencies, you've seen them, like their websites, they just list all the tactical skills like PPC, SEM, SEO, whatever. Clients don't understand that. The agencies are doing well speaking client pain. And I have this story that I tell all the time of how I got fired by a client. He said, well, my plumber doesn't expect me to buy my own pipes. This is why I built AppBind. But it was really the plumber analogy where, I have a wet basement. I hire a person who gives me a dry basement. That's client pain language, the result. They don't care about the pipes and pumps, right? And what's the perceived value? It's not the dry basement. Is that then I can have my dream renovated basement. It's the emotional resonance. And in business, it's the same thing. It's the anxiety, the calm and control. It's very interesting that it keeps coming up over and over again. I just highlight it because these themes seem to be like the conclusions of like this podcast series. Is like, this is the lessons learned. Okay, so what made your story interesting to me is you right from the beginning, you had a plan to escape what we're starting to call, because of all these interviews, the scalability trap. Like where if you're selling labor, the more revenue you have, the more payroll you must have to fulfill it. The payroll turns over next month, therefore the next more revenue you have, and you can't scale your way out of the business risk as an agency owner. I think a lot of agencies feel this treadmill. And the only way out is to actually find margins, right? Where you can start building sustainable business, where you own something as a business rather than just running on the treadmill. And so that's really what I want to inquire about. Like right away, you had a strategy. Like what was that strategy?
Yeah, well, and I think it's important to say strategy, because one thing to keep in mind is that it shifts all the time. like
Sure.
trying, because it took me a while to figure out what was going to get traction. Because of course, when you're building any kind of productized service, you have the product market fit, which is, does the audience you're serving actually want it? And then the product messaging, which is how you communicate. So I always kind of look at things through that lens. So I tried a lot of different things. So at one point, it was to do, because what's scalable, right? You have to productize your services. I started there. But to me, the agency was always a vehicle to get to where I wanted to be, which is where I am today with like a software company. But along the journey, I did productized services and a variety of ways of doing that so I could scale it. Then I also looked at a training company. So I started a training company to take a lot of what I learned and distribute that, because courses and trainings are very high margin. And then I tried software. My first software flopped. It wasn't really getting a lot of traction. It was a software around strategic planning, which, obviously isn't the sexiest thing, but to me, it's probably the most important thing agents, business should have, but they don't know what they don't know. And it's hard to sell that. And so I basically took that software over a period of a couple of years and reconfigured it for a specific niche, for a specific purpose. And that's kind of where I got the podcast One Sheet today and Castocity. It's basically reworkings of the software I created 4 years ago or so in the agency world.
Yeah, I mean, I'm an abstract thinker, probably much similar to you. And I always look at AppBind's well, this is what you should do was my original pitch. Like a doctor says, you should probably exercise, but realize you have to get down to a Tuesday afternoon problem is like, well, I want to go dancing on the weekend for my wedding. Okay, well then you should do some exercises. Okay. Yes. So you tried a bunch of different strategies, which I think I like. Yeah. And then obviously you mentioned the pandemic, to me, that was something that really helped you prioritize. But so you're building a book, a training, and a software. Like these are the three different strategies.
Yeah. So at the time, right before the pandemic, my intention was to build my personal brand. I worked with some PR agencies, some personal, because at that time I was going down more of the training company route. And so I created this training company called Results Train to teach all the stuff I was learning. And it was kind of the non-sexy stuff intentionally. So it was like strategic planning, conversion optimization, analytics, the stuff that really matters that people there's no trainings on those ideas. I still think it's a viable idea if someone wants to run with it, but it was tough to get off the out of the gates. And so one of the best ways to build your personal brand, which I think every agency should do this as well, is through a book. So you do the whole book and you do the tour and you do the PR. And so part of that, of course, is a podcast book tour. So I wrote this book. My intention was to go around virtually at this point because that was right around the pandemic. So I started meeting with all these podcasters, and I realized that podcasters had the exact problems that I'm trying to solve, which is how do you market and monetize in a scalable way. And so that's why I decided to take all that I've done and kind of narrow it down to a very specific niche, which, from an agency perspective, that's a great takeaway too, because if you have a broad, there's different models of agencies. One of them is to kind of serve everybody. Other one is a verticals, you serve a specific vertical, which I did in the corporate world, is mostly automotive. Another model is to focus it around a product. So, hey, we just do SEO, we're the best in SEO, or we just repurpose content, or whatever it is. And so what I decided to do, which was something new for me, is to focus on a specific niche. I'd done it in the corporate world, and there's different pluses and minuses to each one, but that's kind of how I ended up in the podcast world, was purely by creating my own marketing and realizing a problem as I went along the way, and then deciding to kind of focus on that niche.
It's very interesting. And you said, by the way, you're doing productized services. Like, what were the productized services that you were selling?
Well, I'm kind of obsessive, so I productize literally everything.
Yeah.
And so
that's a good lesson. That's really what I'm trying to tease out. I mean, that's basically your answer, right? But what was it you did?
Yeah, I mean, well, in terms of process or what products?
Well, when people say productized service, it can mean a few different things. It could be, repeated coaching, could be a software product, it could be whatever. But I was curious what you would think it is.
Yeah. So what we did was we listed all the different services we provided. And what I had my team do, because at one point we had like up to 20 people, I think, we had each person kind of document their process with screen captures and everything else. And so we're able to kind of first identify exactly what they were doing, how much time it took, how to, we had it in a project management tool. And we really understood what it was. And that was again, going back to the lesson I talked about before, what's the real value and what we're doing to achieve that real value. And then what's the perceived value? So taking that and then packaging it in a way that's attractive to clients. And so we took that and we had specific, packages that they could buy and at different price points that had specific things in them. I know we're not going down this route today, but it eventually led us to the point of doing points-based pricing.
Well, I think it's interesting. I mean, I love to dive into points-based pricing. Just touch, but let's touch on it. We don't run out of time. Like, what are the names of like the different packages? I think people, a lot of this is another one of those winning scenarios that keeps coming up. It's like writing everything down as if like the world's going to end and you want to pass it on to the next generation. Because even for yourself, you forget what you did 6 months ago, right? It's interesting.
Yeah, and that's actually how we started the training company too, because we took all of our documentation and then packaged it in another way. So one of the benefits of doing this is you can have it in different, when you productize, you can have it in different formats. So that's the other win of doing it, because when you have something productized, that could be the product you sell as an agency. It could also become a booklet. It could also become a lead magnet. It could also become a training company. It could also be used as consultant. Actually, I'm doing consulting today. I'm consulting agencies and SaaS companies on how they do growth, because it takes a certain amount of time to scale a SaaS company. So what I'm taking is a lot of the stuff I productize and repackaging it in different ways now as a consultant, as opposed to an agency. So the power is not just, hey, I can use this to sell it. I can use it in multiple formats, which I can use to build my own audience. I can use it to sell. I mean, it's a kind of a no-brainer. But to answer your question, we came up with different terms. My agency had a kind of a fishing theme because it was called Big Fish. And so I can't remember the exact packages, to be honest, but it was something like, the explorer, the captain, whatever, kind of different names that connotate, the minnow. I think at one point we did like the minnow, the whale, depending on the size of package. And it would be like, I can't remember the exact prices, but I think it was like 3,000 a month, 5,000 a month, 7,000 a month. It was all recurring revenue. That's the other key thing too. Like, I don't know how advanced everyone is that's listening, but this is pretty standard nowadays. But if you're not doing recurring based revenue, you're crazy. Like, don't do project based. Hey, I'm going to do a website, get paid, and I'm done. That's a horrible way to run an agency. You always want to have it where you're getting $3,000 a month, $5,000 a month. And usually what you want to do is get paid in advance. So they pay when they sign the agreement, and then after that you work on it, and then you build. So you're always billing in advance, and also if you can incorporate implementation or setup fees. That was the other thing that I applied from my corporate world.
Yeah, preaching to the choir. I mean, that's basically what we support with AppBind, is that whole model, because that's the only way out, honestly. Just do you have a couple examples of the productized services for the agencies? Give them some brainstorming idea of what you ended up building.
Sure. So I mean, at the first iteration of this, it was like, okay, here's what you're going to get. It would be like a local package. You get local SEO, you get AdWords up to a certain amount, you get so much retargeting. We'd always have kind of levels to it. It'd be like per location in terms of franchises. So if one franchise might have 20 locations, the pricing would be per location. It would also be based on ad spend. So it'd be up to a certain ad spend, and so that was kind of where we started, very basic productization. Eventually we got to the point where we had campaigns, because when I think of marketing, and if you work with the best companies, they don't think in a siloed way. Like, they don't think, oh, we're doing SEO, oh, we're doing paid search. What you should be thinking about is wrapping your campaigns around an offer. So that's kind of where we moved to. It's like, okay, here's our offer. Our offer is to have them, in my case, my offer is, get a free podcast one sheet. That's an offer. And then there's various ways to send traffic to it. So we had offers for, someone purchasing, campaigns for someone purchasing, campaigns to get someone back to you that was a client, 5 years ago. We had campaigns for indoctrinating someone, for engaging someone. So we had different kinds of campaigns. And so we kind of moved to that model. And that would be a collection of different kinds of strategies and tactics. So that immediately differentiated us, because we're selling a solution to a problem as opposed to just the tactics. And that's kind of where we got into the product-based pricing, because it's a mix of things. It's not like, oh, we're doing, so it would be a little bit of SEO, a little bit of paid search. And then the problem quickly becomes, okay, how do we shift from one series of campaigns to another? And again, that's kind of where we got into the productization and the points-based pricing, because we would say, hey, look, instead of buying a particular package, let's buy a collection of credits, and those credits can be deployed. We can do 2 campaigns to drive traffic, 2 campaigns to drive leads, and another campaign to drive sales from your email list.
Yeah,
so
perfect.
That's kind of where it quickly evolved to.
Well, and as you tell the story, it makes sense, because from the client's point of view, you're not selling your tactical. They don't care. For them, it's like, again, it's like the plumber. Like they just want a dry basement. They want results, right? And then you are the skilled person deciding which of the strategies generates that result for them, right?
Right.
And then so then the points allow you to shift internally while managing your costs, margins.
Yeah. So we went backwards. So a lot of people think forward. Oh, we're going to do SEO. So what am I going to sell? Well, I'm going to sell SEO. Oh, I do paid search. Guess what I'm going to sell? Well, I'm going to sell paid search. To me, that's not in the best interest of the client. So instead, we went to the client and worked backwards. Say, here's the result they want. What's the combination of tactics that would actually achieve that result? And that would become a campaign.
Yeah, brilliant. I mean, that's brilliant. And that's probably why you had very long-term recurring clients, because you became part of their lives, right?
Yeah.
And then, you mentioned, because of the points-based pricing, you're also managing your margins. You got a pretty healthy margins. I don't know if you're willing to disclose roughly how much margins that you ended up investing back into building a software company, but do you know what the margins were? Were you willing to disclose that to the audience?
From the service I think you always have to think in terms of when you're pricing something, marking up, if you buy anything, if you buy I don't know why this came to my mind, because probably I had to buy one for my wife or something, but a pocketbook. If you bought a pocketbook at a retailer, they're marking it up 2-3 times. And the problem is agencies don't think that way. So you have to kind of take what your costs are and at least triple it. And so you should be making, 60+ margin on different products. Mm-hmm. And so that's essentially how I built my packaging, but you have to make sure you can achieve 10x result. So if you're going to charge someone $3,000, you should be able to drive $30,000 to them. So you always have to have that. So you got to kind of create your margin where you have that buffer for yourself, and also where you can serve them. So that's kind of the margin on a product-based perspective. From a company perspective, we actually never broke a profit. And we did that intentionally, because my goal, again, the agency was a vehicle, not something I wanted to actually scale. And so basically every penny I made along the way, I invested into really systems. At the end of the day, those productized systems. So it was, having the team document things, having the training company built. And eventually, like I said, the core focus was to building the software company. So pretty much everything I had, I plowed into where I am today.
Well, so smart. Like I had another from this podcast, an agency said, like, what do I own? This is at the beginning of the pandemic. And I think this touches on your story. He was worried because he didn't own anything. He was on this treadmill of always having to find a new client. And then with the pandemic coming, at the beginning, if you remember, a lot of us lost a lot of our clients. Yeah. And something similar happened to you, but then you owned something because you were investing in yourself. So what happened during the pandemic, and what did you end up, how did it help you transform to where you are now, which I think is a better place for you, actually, ultimately?
Yeah, no, I've never been happier, but at the time it was painful. We lost 80% of our clients. And I've always known enough to be diversified, but literally the pandemic hit right when I was in transition. So I was in transition to the training company and wasn't focused on the agency as much. And so we had a lot of clients in the worst verticals, travel, weddings, just everything where you had to be in person, basically. And so we lost literally 8% of our revenue overnight. And so that was very painful, but it pushed me to kind of work even faster to get the software off the ground.
And so now let's go back to the software. This is why I asked you to pitch it. Well, it's also courtesy, but like, what is, so what did you end up having a lot of the baseline assets in this existing business that led you to the product in Castocity. So what was the effort you had to do from what did you have and what did you have, how did it allow you to create the podcast one sheet?
Yeah. So if you think about a one sheet, I kind of gave a basic description of it. It's like a resume for getting podcast interviews, but what goes into it? Well, first you need to be able to create the one sheet itself. So certain software I had my strategic planning I use for that, but a big part of it, and this is the part that people miss, one of the reasons people do a podcast or do a podcast interview is because they want to make an impact. And that impact might be growing their audience, their income, their personal mission, but all that comes down to your communication. So can you clearly communicate your messaging, your value proposition, all the different components that go into your business? And I realized most people don't know how to do that. And so I leveraged a lot of my training company, the software, the different products I had to create systems for creating your messaging that are incorporated directly into the software. You also need to know how to create a persona, because you might have great messaging, but if you don't know who you're serving first, which is your persona, then your messaging is going to fall flat. So back when I had my software company for the agency, I created a persona builder. I actually own the domain buyer persona. That's how seriously I took this.
Oh, yeah.
And so what I incorporated into the podcast one sheet is also a buyer persona. So directly from the software I created to serve agency clients, which is personas and messaging, that's incorporated right into the podcast one sheet. And then a future version, what are you going to do once you got a podcast interview? Well, you probably want to promote it. How would you promote it? Well, you need to create marketing assets. You need to create banner ads, social media posts. And so the software, the next version of it actually is going to automate the creation of all those marketing assets. So again, that comes directly from my agency background. So pretty much my life journey is really kind of coming to fruition through this software.
Yeah. And so I wanted to repitch it because then, like, touching back on the lessons I heard from your story, and you have more, I know, but for this podcast. So a couple of things that you mentioned that has led to this formation. Number one, you're focusing on client world problems rather than what you can do for them tactically. Like, no one cares if the plumber can solder or weld or fit pipes. They care about their dry basement. That's the analogy. And in your case, you're talking about promotion, marketing of your growth of your podcast, number one, right? Then number two, productize, like figure out a system, find something that's a Tuesday afternoon problem and you could sell them. You had because you've been doing it all along, you had assets, systems in place that you could re-leverage, right? And then finally, your next version of the product, once you get them in the door, is selling them all these tactical things, right? But that's not what clients care about. They care about, you're talking about the benefit, and then you're providing them a mix of tactics, just like your agency, so that they can get to the end result. I think, your level of experience and strategy and thinking and execution shines through in everything you're doing here. It's like, I'm so thankful that you could come here and tell your story. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
So last question, how do people find you?
Yeah, so probably the best way is my personal website because it links out to all the things I have. So you go to meettonyg.com, and right from there you can connect with me directly on social media. You can even send me an email because there's a contact form. Happy to help anyone out, or offer my 2 cents to help take your agencies to the next level.
And then and your product company is Castocity, castocity.com, right?
Right. Kind of like it kind of harkens back to my automotive days with the idea of velocity, like going fast. So podcast faster in a sense. So cast, like podcast, ocity, faster, Castocity.
Amazing. Thank you so much, everyone. And thanks again for joining us for another Agency Connect one-on-one. For more great insights on partnerships and software, like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next video.